You get that, Alex?
What link is that? Sorry, is it in the?
See if I can.
I just clicked the URL to join it. So sorry. Can you go over that again?
If you go to lakesideohio.com/calendar, we have it listed on the virtual Chautauqua series. It's like a purple bar that's at the top of each of the dates. So it's on that. And then it's also on the Lakeside Chautauqua Facebook page.
Okay. All right. I will go do that and enter in that way for you guys.
Sorry if I threw a wrench into all of this by sending the link to her.
Oh no, we're all learning together. Everyone is learning and figuring out how to do each of these things. The access points are interesting. I realize I can't access a lot of our programs that we normally would. Okay.
Well, we can't possibly have this go without a flaw, right? Without any
Exactly. Okay. Well, we will go ahead and get started then. We're already recording and we are live streaming. So welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for week 4 of our virtual Chautauqua lecture series. My name is Dakota Harkins and I'm the Director of Education and Heritage Programming here at Lakeside Chautauqua. This week we'll begin our theme on Great Lakes Adventures. And before we get to that, I do have a few reminders. I know quite a few of you have already been in the webinar with us here for a few minutes. But all of our programs, our education series programs that you'll be able to watch this summer will be on our lakesideohio.com/calendar page. So if you go to the Lakeside website and click on the calendar, each of the dates that one of the programs you would want to view, they have a purple banner on them. And on that banner, if you click on it, it'll take you to a separate page that has all of our Zoom webinar links. So those will allow you directly into the webinar, which is where Matt is joining us today. But those links will then turn into the recorded video after the program is done. So another option that we have available at this point is viewing on Facebook. So we do have all of our recorded programs getting directly live streamed to Facebook. If you have any questions throughout the season about how to access any of the programs or what our calendar looks like, please feel free to contact me at dharkins@lakesideohio.com. And then another reminder for everyone who is joining us in the webinar, I've already gotten a couple questions, but if you are in the webinar, make sure you please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's where I'll be moderating questions throughout the program today. If you are watching on Facebook, you can put Facebook questions in your comments. And all of those we'll try to be fielding together to ask Matt at the end of our program. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Matt Kovach, who is joining us, I'm assuming from Marblehead, but he is I want to get your title right, the Lake Erie Coastal Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy. And he's working on a lot of projects up in this area, and he's working behind the scenes to really help Lake Erie and all of us who enjoy it. So today he's going to be telling us a little bit more about Lake Erie's history and some of the projects, and then he will be back with us again tomorrow to continue this discussion. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Matt. Matt, thanks for joining us this morning.
Sure. Thanks, Dakota. And thank you everyone for sitting in, listening in. I am joining you from Marblehead. This is my house and I live about a mile west of the main gate on North Shore Boulevard, right across from Camp Run and Muck. So I'm not too horribly far away. I apologize in advance if you hear a dog bark or you see my wife run past or something like that. This is life in 2020. So I guess I'll do what I can with that. I'm going to open up my, let me share my screen real quick, and then I'll try to leave my camera going. But if for some reason it starts cutting out, or if my signal starts getting low, someone just yell at me or Dakota yell at me, and I can switch my camera off to save a little bit of Wi-Fi. Like Dakota said, I'm the Lake Erie Coastal Program Manager with the Nature Conservancy, and the first talk that I'm going to be talking about is really focused on kind of the background of the Great Lakes and Lake Erie and environmental issues. This isn't really going to it's not going to be a real deep dive into a lot of the environmental challenges that we face. That's going to be tomorrow. So that's kind of a plug for you guys to join in tomorrow if you can. Today is going to be basically starting about 20,000 years ago and going up until right around today. How the Great Lakes formed and all of that stuff, and how that influences what we're seeing today, the environmental challenges that we're seeing today, And then tomorrow is going to really be focusing on, okay, now that we have that background, now we can jump into how are we fixing these things, and what am I doing in the Nature Conservancy and all these other partners? What are we doing to address that? And what does the future really hold for us? So with that, I'm going to jump into just the talk today. Here's some of the stuff that we're going to be going over. And first part is me. So again, my name's Matt. I grew up here in Marblehead on Church Road. So I have been here, I'm 35 years old now, and for the first 18 years of my life, I lived in Marblehead and then went to college and spent summers here. I used to run charter boats out on Lake Erie. I ran for Tibbles Marina, and now my job has brought me back here. So a little bit more about me. That's me, and that's my son, Jack. We're out at Great Egret Marsh Preserve. It's a nature preserve I manage across from East Harbor State Park. So who am I? Why am I here? Well, I already told you some of that. I used to run charter boats. This place really, the natural resources of this region really drove me to pursue the career that I'm pursuing right now. This is my lovely wife, Amanda. You may have seen her already walking by. That's us scuba diving on Lake Erie. We got married on Lake Erie. This is at East Harbor State Park about 10 years ago, well, at least 10 years ago on June 26th. So, you know, this place has always had a really big impact on my life. Also, I'm here because I make a tremendous amount of money being an environmentalist. Doing the work that I do, that's a lie. If you want to make money, don't go into environmental science. But at the same time, I'm here because I'm passionate about what I'm doing. I care about this region, and I want this region, I want my son there, Jack, who is now 6.5 years old. I want him to grow up in a world that is better than the one that I'm getting, or that I grew up in. The Lorax, if you guys are all familiar with it, I know I can't see all of you, but I'm sure most all of you have heard this and seen this. The movie, The Lorax, or the book, the original book, The Lorax, if you're, you didn't realize this, when Dr. Seuss originally wrote it, you know, this is when it's getting really bad, right? The, what is it? The one slur, he's cutting down all the trees and polluting everything to make his whatchamacallits or whatever. And he actually gave a call out to Lake Erie because it was so horribly polluted that, you know, things weren't living in there. He did switch that and remove that from the book. I want to say it was in the mid-late 70s or so. But at one point, we actually had a call out on it. And that's really why I'm here, because what I'm doing, you know, like I said, I'm trying to make the world better for my son. And that quote from the Lorax really sticks out to me, that unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So with that, that's me. Great Lakes history and formation. The environmental challenges that Lake Erie and the Great Lakes face really is a byproduct of the lake itself and the lakes itself, and geologically speaking, how these things formed. You have to understand all of those things in order to fix the problems that we're facing. Before that, though, I wanted to call this out real quick. On June 23rd, 1950, this was a little bit before I was born, there was a crash of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 going from New York City to Minneapolis. It crashed into Lake Michigan. And to this day, that plane has never been found. They found, oh man, it's automatically scrolling. They found pieces and parts of that plane, but they never found the entire thing. The reason I say that, the Great Lakes are big. These are huge, huge bodies of water. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize, the size and the scale of these things. So anyway, Great Lakes are there. Going way back into the last ice age, the Wisconsin glaciation, you can see the extent of that glacier on North America. And one of the things that you see is that glacier, those glaciers were covering the entire Great Lakes region. And really, the Great Lakes region was formed by those glaciers. And with glaciers, you know, when we had about 2 miles of ice or so, we think 2 miles of ice or 2 miles of water over the land surface, that's a tremendous amount of pressure pushing down on the Earth's crust. And the actual crust of the Earth sank down and was compressed down and pushed down into the mantle when those glaciers were here. Obviously, those glaciers aren't here anymore. That water, for the most part, you know, that 2 miles of water is gone. and that crust has been rebounding. So the land itself around here has been rebounding and rising back up over time. And that's a process that, generally speaking, where we are right now, it's kind of equalized back out. But there are still parts in the upper Great Lakes, up in the upper peninsula of Michigan and other places, that the ground is still rising a little bit. I can't remember how much. We're talking like a millimeter or so per year. It's not having much of an impact now, and it probably won't have too much of an impact going into the future. So if we look at the Great Lakes and how they were formed with the glaciers, we start at the top left here, about 14,000 years ago. You can see kind of the extent of, as these, and even at this point, the glaciers were essentially retreating. They were melting at the end of the Ice Age. Back about 14,000 years ago, we had kind of two lakes in the Great Lakes. We had Lake Maumee that you can see on this image. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. I'm pointing at it, whether you guys can tell or not. So Lake Maumee was much, much higher than Lake Erie is today. It's set at about 780 feet of elevation. For reference today, Lake Erie sits at about 574.3 feet of elevation. That's as of Friday. So when we had that much water here, we also had, because we had that much water here, and we had these glaciers that were essentially forming a great big dam on the eastern side of Lake Erie, water actually flowed up through Michigan, across the lower peninsula of Michigan, into what you can see on there is Lake Chicago, which sat pretty high, and it actually flowed down into the Mississippi River and out into the Gulf of Mexico. You guys are all probably aware now that the Great Lakes no longer flow into the Gulf of Mexico. The Great Lakes now flow through the St. Lawrence Seaway and out into the Atlantic Ocean. So 14,000 years ago, that's what was happening. 9,000 years ago, as this lake, or as those glaciers were retreating, it started changing how, and with that, the crust that starts rebounding, it changes how the lakes were forming and the configuration of those lakes, because now that dam that was holding up the lakes with the glacier was gone. So then we move into that 9,000 years ago. That glacier kept retreating. 7,000 years ago, it changed once again. And it changed to the point that Lake Huron, which currently flows into Lake Erie, was no longer flowing into Lake Erie. Lake Erie actually was quite a bit lower than it is today. And then roughly 4,000 years ago, the Great Lakes were pretty similar to the configuration they are today, although we still had the Ottawa River that was flowing from Lake Huron out. That doesn't happen anymore. But this, about 4,000 years ago, we started getting into the kind of conformation of the lakes that we see today. This chart shows the Great Lakes, or I'm sorry, Lake Erie and former versions of Lake Erie, and there's been a lot along the time frame of the elevation of the lake, which is shown on the kind of the y-axis there, and over time, generally what's been happening to those lakes. And one of the things that you see is about 10,000 years ago, Lake Erie was kind of starting to form pretty similar to where it is today. Then about 2,000 years ago, we're getting pretty close to the configuration and lake level that we see today. The highest we really ever saw during the Lake Maumee stage was about 800 foot or a little bit less above sea level. And again, today we're at about 574. You can still see the impacts of both those former those glaciers that were here, as well as the former Great Lake Erie stages. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not, but this is a elevational image of Ohio, the state of Ohio. And one of the things you can see, Lake Erie elevation, again, is about 574 feet. That's what's shown on here. The lowest point in Ohio is actually where the Ohio River leaves. It's southwestern corner of the lake. The highest point is Campbell Hill, which is in kind of west central Ohio. And if you look on this map, you can actually see, Dakota, can you see my cursor, the little arrow that I have?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, perfect. If you see these little lines, these are actually glacial moraine lines. When the glacier advanced, it kind of retreated a little bit and advanced. It basically left a bunch of dirt in some places, and that's what you see here on these lines. You also see, it's kind of hard to see it on here, but there's some distinctive areas like this bump right here. This was the shoreline of Lake Warren back in the day. And it's found just west of Toledo, out by the Toledo airport in the Oak Openings region. So that formed, you know, those glaciers and those previous lakes formed a lot of the geology that's present here today. So a little bit more about the Great Lakes. We've talked about kind of how they formed originally. We're going to be going back to a lot of these images because we're going to be referencing them, because all of these things, they build up. It's like math, right? Well, by the time you get to calculus in high school, if you didn't have algebra early on, you're not going to get it. So we're going to be kind of bouncing back and forth with some of these old maps. So again, obviously Lake Erie has been changing quite a bit over time. We're really starting to talk now about this modern day period, right? Of say from about 4,000 years before present up until today. And again, lake level today sits about 574 feet, so right about here. And it really hasn't been changing that much over the past few thousand years, and it probably won't be changing too much, at least until Niagara Falls eventually erodes through until we hit Lake Erie. Then Lake Erie will, you know, completely drain into Lake Ontario, and then we won't even have Lake Erie left, but that's 15,000 years or so later. Now that's for other generations to worry about. The Great Lakes are huge. It's just 20% of the world's fresh water is found in the Great Lakes. And as I mentioned before, it's hard to overstate the size of the Great Lakes. You guys are familiar with Lakeside, right? Lakeside is right about here. You know, from Lakeside, you can't see, it's not very often anyway, that you can see to the other side over to Canada. You can sometimes be able to see, I don't even think you can see it from Lakeside, but sometimes you can see Pelee Island, which is shown like right here. You certainly can't see all the way across over towards Buffalo, you know, 200 and some odd miles away from the western end. The Great Lakes, there's a couple of things about the Great Lakes. One of which is they're all connected together. They all flow. And what this basin shows is essentially the outline of the watershed of the Great Lakes. And because those Great Lakes flow, this image is essentially a system profile of the Great Lakes. Shows Lake Superior being the deepest, 1,300 feet deep, and it starts up high. And the Great Lakes, Lake Superior flows to the St. Mary's River down into Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are essentially connected at the Straits of Mackinac right here. They sit at the same water level. There is enough of an opening there underneath the Mackinac Bridge that those lakes really operate kind of similarly in terms of water levels. So those two lakes together flow through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, which is kind of sort of a Great Lake. We're going to ignore it for now. Flow through the Detroit River into Lake Erie, which is by far the shallowest of the Great Lakes. Lake Erie then flows over through the Niagara River, over Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario. And Lake Ontario then flows out through the St. Lawrence River all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So all of these lakes really are connected in a big way. And because of that, one of the things that happens, the Lake Superior, so this image shows basically depths of the Great Lakes, blue being deeper, red being shallower. Not surprising, Lake Erie is very, very shallow. It shows up on here as basically all red and orange. Lake Superior, incredibly deep. The bigger that body of water is, the longer it takes for that water to flow out. So Lake Superior has a residence time. What that means is every drop of water that falls into Lake Superior, it generally takes it about 200 years for every drop of water in Lake Superior to flow out, to be flushed out through that. Whereas you take Lake Erie on the other side, it's about 2 years on average for each drop of water to flow. It comes in from the Detroit River and everywhere else to flow out through Niagara Falls. Lake Erie has this rapid refreshing of water through the lake, and that impacts a lot of what we see in our lake. Again, you guys this probably isn't too surprising for you. Most of you, if you're on here, you've heard Lake Erie is the shallowest. Lake Erie also has kind of 3 distinct basins. And this is something we'll talk more and more about tomorrow if you guys listen in, because these basins impact how the lake functions and the environmental issues that are associated with them. So we are, again, Lakeside being right here. The Western Basin generally runs from Point Pelee down south to somewhere around here, depending on where you look at it, whether it's over to Lorain or over to Sandusky. Either way, this portion is the Western Basin. When you go east of that, you get into the Central Basin of Lake Erie, which is the biggest of those basins. And the Central Basin goes all the way over to around Erie, Pennsylvania. That's kind of the cutoff. I don't know if you can see this dotted line. That's the eastern, the boundary between Ohio and Pennsylvania. And then when you go even farther east, you get into the Eastern Basin, the deepest part of Lake Erie. And that's over by New York, or, New York boundary is right here. So we have to introduce this watershed concept. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but it basically talks about the watershed concept is essentially if a drop of rain falls, where does that drop of rain flow, assuming it doesn't evaporate? All of you guys have heard of the Continental Divide in the United States, right? It runs down the spine of the Rocky Mountains. If water falls on the east side of it, it flows into the Atlantic Ocean. If it's on the west side of it, a drop of water falls, it's going to flow into the Pacific Ocean. That boundary, that divide, is essentially a watershed boundary between the two. And the Great Lakes are heavily influenced by their watersheds. And you can see that on here. Lake Superior has this kind of peach-colored watershed. And one thing you see, it's a very big watershed compared to, or I'm sorry, it's a very big lake with a relatively small watershed by volume. Lake Michigan, same thing. Lake Huron, same thing. Lake Erie has such a very, very small water volume that its watershed to volume ratio is very, very, very large. So we have a relatively large watershed and a relatively small lake. So that's going to be really, really important for some of the impacts and environmental situations that we deal with here. This map also shows what those watershed boundaries look like, but this also shows you those in relation to what the ground cover within that watershed is. Unsurprisingly, if you guys have been up to the northern or up to the upper peninsula of Michigan and northern Lake Michigan, or I'm sorry, northern lower peninsula of Michigan, most of it is forested. And that's what you see here in green. When you get down into southern Michigan and certainly northwestern Ohio and Lake Erie, western Lake Erie Basin watershed, it's almost all agricultural land, which again is going to have some important impacts. Remember the amount of water that goes through Lake Erie? It's a relatively short residence time in Lake Erie because there's so much water flowing through here. It just doesn't have that much time for that water to sit and accumulate. So talk a little bit about the Great Lakes. Let's talk about the Great Black Swamp region. Let's talk about that watershed specifically in Lake Erie. So the Great Black Swamp it's this portion of Ohio and Indiana where under previous Lake Erie water level, previous Lake Erie stages, this area was essentially the bottom of the lake. Remember during that Lake Maumee stage when water levels were, when Lake Maumee was at about, say, 800 foot above sea level, this whole area was underwater. And one of the things that happens when you're underwater is wave energy kind of flattens everything out. So if you go out into Lake Erie, off a lakeside a mile or so, it's relatively flat, relatively muddy for the most part. Because of all of that, the wave action that kind of plane everything out. This region is, I'm sure a lot of you have driven through there, is very, very flat. And it's all that lake planed area. The other thing that happens is all of that water, the water that's flowing into the Great Lakes, generally it's carrying sediment. So with our rivers, we're carrying sand, which is very, very coarse grain, very big grains. They settle out quickly. It's carrying silt and clays, which are finer grain particles. Now the finer grain particles, they stay up in the water column much longer. So when they're carried in by the rivers, they're going to float out into the middle of the lake before they eventually settle down. And that's one of the reasons, and that happened out here. It's one of the reasons why this area has such a dense clay for the majority of the ground. Very flat, very dense clay. And that's essentially what formed the Great Black Swamp region of Ohio. And this was kind of pre-European settlement into early European settlement days, about 1,500 square miles. So it was a relatively large area. And most of it looked kind of like this, at least in the springtime. It was a swamp. It was a forested wetland that was out here. And it wasn't real conducive to the kind of European settlement that we have today. So we fixed it. About 1900, we cut out a lot of the forests that were here. Oak Harbor got its name because they were exporting a lot of timber and lumber from that area, from the Great Black Swamp. And that's, so there was a huge amount of deforestation that occurred. The other thing that happened was we drained that swamp. And one of the ways that we drained it was Buckeye Ditch Digger. I think they're I think there's something in Lakeside about it, isn't there? I don't know if there's an example of it. I feel like I've seen that before. But basically what it did is we ditched off. We basically took the entire landscape. We dug ditches throughout it. And one of the ways they were able to do that is some new inventions like this, the Buckeye Ditch Digger and some of those other things around 1900. So now we've removed the forested watershed that was there in that Great Black Swamp. And we've also removed the water. So now water that used to fall during the days when we still had that Great Black Swamp, that wetland, it essentially acted like a great big sponge for water. It would hold water, and when water would fall, it would very slowly kind of percolate through those wetlands into our rivers and out into the lake. So the water would have been much clearer coming out of there. We wouldn't have had many nutrients and things like that coming out because they were essentially filtered out by that wetland. So today, obviously, this isn't a surprise. We already talked about this. The vast majority of this region, especially that Great Black Swamp region, which is most of this area, it's now agricultural land. We've made it so that humans can live there and we can grow crops and things there. And that's obviously helped people an awful lot. But it's changed not only the landscape here, but because of the lake is basically influenced by what's flowing into it. So this sort of habitat alteration and landscape alteration within the watershed has dramatic impacts on the lake itself and the environmental conditions that are there today. So again, I kind of showed you this before. The majority of the western basin of Lake Erie, really the majority of Lake Erie's watershed is agricultural land, especially this western basin portion, where Toledo's located here, Lakeside's located right there. So perhaps more than any other Great Lake, Lake Erie is really a product of its watershed. So there is an awful lot of, we'll talk more about that in a little bit, and especially tomorrow. So getting into more of the kind of ecology and getting more into modern day. So by now we've kind of moved, we've drained the Great Black Swamp. We're talking now we're into the 1900s or so. Europeans start colonizing this area and we start, fishing out in the Great Lakes. Lake Erie is by far the smallest Great Lake in terms of from a volume size. Lake Erie doesn't have that much water. Lake Ontario from a surface area size is a little bit smaller than Lake Erie, but it's much, much deeper. So Lake Erie has much less water. So in terms of Lake Erie, that shallow water combined with that big watershed that we have and the habitat complexities that are out here leads to us being a very, very fertile fishery. Without nutrients, we don't have any fish. So fish don't live in a swimming pool. You go into the very center of the ocean, 1,000 miles from any point of land, the water is very, very, very sterile. There really isn't that much that can survive in it because there's virtually no nutrients. Lake Erie being so shallow, being so warm, being so fertile, we have a tremendous fishery. We only have 2% of the Great Lakes water, but we actually have 50% of the fish of all of the Great Lakes is found in Lake Erie. So this chart is showing just raw numbers, millions of pounds of fish harvested out of Lake Erie, going back from when we started having records in the late 1800s to up through today. We didn't pull data up to modern day, but this general trend is still there. So in looking at it in terms of raw pounds of fish, Lake Erie has more than any other lake. Now, when we look at it in terms of pounds of fish per gallons of water, if you want to look at it more in like a per capita type basis, look at how stark it looks. Lake Erie absolutely dwarfs all of the other lakes in terms of its fishery. And that's, a testament to that fertility that we have in the lake. Why do we have that? Well, water temperature. Lake Erie is the shallowest. It's the warmest of those. We also have that very shallow, diverse habitat. We have extensive coastal wetlands. We'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow if you guys join in. And we have a lot of nutrients. If you look at Lake Superior's watershed, it looks very different. We don't have nearly the amount of nutrients flowing. Lake Superior is pretty low in terms of nutrients and fertility. This has led to things like Lake Erie being called the walleye capital of the world. And there's a handful of other locations throughout the world that make the same claim. But in terms of numbers of fish, pounds of fish, really there's nothing in the world that compares to it. The downside to that is that fertility of the lake is we have issues such as algal blooms, where we get a little too much nutrients, and now all of a sudden we get bad impacts. We get harmful algal blooms that are generated. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later too. And in what was this, 2014, that we had the Toledo water crisis, where essentially a harmful algal bloom that occurred in the lake made Toledo's drinking water unsafe to use, and they shut off they had to essentially stop using their water for about 500,000 people in Toledo, Ohio for 3 days. We also, because of the habitat complexity that we have and the shape of the lake, and again, more stuff we'll talk about tomorrow, we have now become the warbler capital of the world, especially Port Clinton area and going farther west out towards Oak Harbor. We have huge numbers of migrating songbirds that come through here, and this is probably the best place in the world to see all of those birds. That's why we have that biggest week of American birding each year. We also have really, really rich waterfowl hunting heritage in Lake Erie, and especially the Lake Erie coastal marshes. This is a picture of East Harbor this past, I want to say it was February when I took this photo. I didn't count the number of ducks out there, but there's a lot. And you can kind of see what that picture looks like. If you guys haven't been around in the wintertime, we're home to one of the biggest overwintering concentrations of waterfowl in the world that happens each winter. And there's just kind of another picture of it. I don't know how many ducks are out there, but you can see a lot in this open water. This is ice cover out in the harbor. Then there's a whole other raft that's way out there. It's really hard to kind of see the scale of it. That's South Bass Island and Perry's Monument off in the distance too, to give you guys a reference for where this is. East Harbor State Park is in this distance, and the beach is right out there. So I'm going to just take a really quick break. I'm going to grab another glass of water, and I'll be back here in just like one more minute. And we can, I don't know if anyone has any questions, we could answer those. Otherwise we can, I can kind of jump back into the rest of all of this stuff.
We haven't had any questions pop up so far.
Okay, well, I'm going to grab a glass of water. If anybody has any, now would be a great time to raise them. And if not, and maybe in another minute, we can jump back into it, if that works.
That sounds good.
Cool. All right, thanks.
And as a reminder for everyone who joined us a little bit later on in the program, we made a few announcements at the beginning. All of our programs this season, so all of the Chautauqua Lecture Series for each week, they are going to be available. They're being recorded now, and they're going to be available on our lakesideohio.com calendar. So for those who are reaching out and trying to connect with us, those are on our website, but please feel free to email me at dharkins@lakesideohio.com if you do have more questions. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks, that was a really long break.
Yeah, it was.
So did anybody have any questions at all?
We haven't had any come in yet. There's a tendency for most of them to be saved for the end. Mm-hmm.
No problem. All right. Well, I didn't mean to have a huge break. I just figured I'd want to grab a glass of water. So with that, I guess we'll keep on keeping on. So we talked, that was a lot about the background, how the Great Lakes were formed and how our local region was kind of formed. Now let's jump into more, modern day local kind of issues in terms of our coastal habitat. One of the reasons Lakeside is named Lakeside is because it's on the lake, right? Most of you guys go there to see and experience and enjoy the coastal habitat that's there. Oh, did I see a question? How does salt fit into the Lake Erie picture? Ooh, that's a good, is that in relation to the Menor Marsh and the salt mining and those sorts of things? Maybe? Yes, okay. So that's, man, that's a good question of how exactly, so Lake Erie, we're talking really old. This is way, way beyond my background experience. There are vast sand salt deposits underneath the, underneath kind of the central basin of Lake Erie, and they mine a lot of that, a tremendous amount of that. So how does that fit into Lake Erie? It's far enough under the lake that it really doesn't influence Lake Erie today. So Lake Erie sits about 570 odd feet above sea level. Water level in the ocean will have to rise quite a bit before we're inundated by salt water. Most of that salt that's underneath Lake Erie is beyond the deep enough and covered by enough of a lens of clay and rock and things that it doesn't really infiltrate into the lake today. Now, there are some environmental impacts, and that's actually an interesting one we could bring up, of how things like that are impacting the lake today, because that is having a really big impact, especially on the area around Menor and Menor Marsh. We talk about Central Lake Erie Basin Dead Zone. Another question, that was something we were going to cover a lot more tomorrow, but I can add that in today because that does kind of influence all of this stuff. I'll raise that when we get into the, we'll talk about algal blooms in a little bit. Just writing a note down to remind myself. But yeah, one of the, tomorrow we were going to jump a lot into, kind of take a deeper dive into that Central Basin Dead Zone, why it's there, how do we fix it, what's kind of the future going to hold for that. But that's not something I was going to have too much of an impact on. So with that, so yeah, we'll kind of jump into coastal stuff. Oh, is there another one? Yes, I was going, that's a good question about the Nature Conservancy. That's something that could raise that right now. So I work for the Nature Conservancy. We are a international nonprofit organization, and our mission is to preserve the lands and waters upon which life depends. So we generally try to solve the environmental problems that are out there. We started as an organization that whose mission was essentially preserving rare plants and animals in special places, right? It started in the 1950s when there were a group of ecologists from the Ecological Society of America, and they realized that a lot of places that were really important, high biodiversity locations, were being developed at a really rapid rate, and there was nobody that was really doing anything about it. So they got together and they started raising money and buying some of those places up so they didn't get developed. And from that, we started, I can't remember, in the early 1960s or 1950s. I should know this stuff better than that. Into today, where we have 4,000 staff, and we work all across the world. We work in all 50 states. And we work across the globe to kind of solve environmental challenges. In Ohio, we kind of focus on a bunch of different areas. It kind of depends on the exact location. A lot of it is the environmental challenges we're working to solve, certainly in Lake Erie, are related to harmful algal blooms and climate change impacts. And how do we fix that? How do we make a world in the future that's going to be better than the one we had in the past? It's better suited to future conditions and things like that. And that's something, again, I was going to talk a lot more about tomorrow, is how do we address these environmental challenges, and what is that? What is the next 5 years, 10, 50, 100 years? What is that going to look like? And why are we doing the stuff that we're doing? I don't have a huge amount of time today to jump into that, but I am hoping that we'll have, maybe half an hour or something like that at the end of this that, we could kind of use as a question and answer session to delve into some of that stuff. So I guess with that, jumping into Lake Erie coastal habitat. There we go. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna play a little bit of a game. I can't hear you guys yell out one or another, but our coastal zone is, a lot of people have this sense that it's just the Great Lakes. I hear that an awful lot when I go to meetings and conferences and I talk to colleagues that work on the Atlantic and the Gulf and the Pacific Coast. It's just a lake. So coastal issues here are very different than coastal issues on the Atlantic coast or elsewhere. And that's really not true. There are some distinct differences, but there's an awful lot of similarities. So this is one of the things that I like to do, is play this Lake Erie or ocean game. So I can't hear you guys yell out, but these are two pictures. Which one is Lake Erie and which one is the Atlantic Ocean? So these are the same storm, Hurricane Sandy. These pictures were taken, the one on the right from Atlantic City, New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy, and the one on the left was Hurricane Sandy in Cleveland, Ohio. So we get these big wave issues and big storm impacts, just like everyone on the Atlantic coast does. Here's another one. This one's probably a little bit easier to tell which is Lake Erie and which is the ocean. especially when you look into the picture on the right and you can see some palm trees. But what we see is storm surge from Tropical Storm Toledo. I don't know if you guys remember that. It's kind of a, it wasn't a formal weather event, but there were some people that gave it that name. We basically had a big nor'easter that came through in June of 2015, and it flooded out a lot. It flooded, this is downtown Port Clinton. This is Fisherman's Wharf in Port Clinton. This is the Portage River that goes out into Lake Erie. It is right here. And storm surge from that nor'easter that came through flooded that out. Same thing happened in Jacksonville Beach, Florida during Hurricane Irma in 2017. Different storm event, but we get those same kind of dynamics of water surge, whether it's, well, that's kind of more topic for tomorrow. But we see the same sort of impacts from storm events. This is an interesting one that affects a lot of what I do is nearshore sediment transport, and how do beaches form and how do they change over time. The one on the left is Grand Isle, Louisiana. The one on the right is Presque Isle, Lake Erie in Pennsylvania. And now this image is flipped upside down, so they look the same. But one of the things this shows is sand movement and sand transport. The same sort of dynamics affect our coastal zone that affect the coastal zone of the Gulf Coast and the East Coast, where you have, when we put offshore breakwalls that you can see here, the same structures that are at East Harbor State Park. We put those in out here, it has the same impacts of trapping sand behind them and forming those. Here's a good one. Well, that's actually England on the left and Cleveland Harbor on the right. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with that one. Here's another one. So on the left, this is Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and on the right, we have Presque Isle, Pennsylvania. Now, the reason I use this image is, yes, we have beaches in both these areas. We also have the same sort of plants, where we have American beach grass here, and you have some in here too. It's a little harder to see because we also have it mixed in with Phragmites on here, as well as out there. But we're about the same latitude as those. We have a similar biology to what they have there. Here's one. I'd ask if people on the that are listening to this have seen any of the white pelicans, but I can't see you, so I hope you have. These are American white pelicans in both of these pictures. The one on the right is Galveston Bay, Texas. This one is Big Chick Island in Lake Erie in Ontario. So this is 13 miles north of that Great Egret Marsh Preserve that I manage, which is across from East Harbor State Park. We have similar animals that are out here as well. Here's a good one. So this is essentially storm-induced erosion that they're seeing on the Seward Peninsula in Alaska on the left, and Lake County, Ohio on the right. Same sorts of impacts we're seeing in both of these areas. And there's a really interesting connection between Alaska and coastal Alaska and coastal Ohio. We're seeing with climate change, warming waters, decreased ice coverage, both here in our wintertime as well as up there. And one of the downsides to that is when we have ice covering the lake, we have no wave energy anymore. It's reducing erosion. Now as our ice dynamics are decreasing, we're seeing more of that erosion with our winter storms than we used to. Exact same things being seen up on coastal Alaska. So I'm working with some of my colleagues right now in Alaska to kind of help. We're both kind of working with each other to figure out, how do we deal with this? How do we address this? How do we prevent this sort of erosion that we're seeing? And that's, again, more for tomorrow. This one's easy, right? This is by a Honda in the Florida Keys, and this is Fort Erie, Ontario. This is really close to Buffalo, New York. The reason I put this in there, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the systems that we work with, but there's also some really, really different, stark differences in our systems. Not very many places in the ocean deal with the sort of sea ice impacts or ice impacts and storm surge and phase shift impacts and all of these things that we deal with here, such as this. And this happened, I think this was not this past winter, but the winter before, where we had a bunch of ice and all of a sudden we had a strong southwest wind, because this is near Buffalo, right? So it's on the northeastern part of the lake. strong southwest wind pushed this big ice floe up into the shoreline. And you guys have probably seen this if you've been here in the wintertime for a while, or you probably see news articles about it if you're not here in the winter, where you'll get ice sheets that basically shove up against our shoreline and buckle and form these big ice flows, or these big ice shoves like that. And that's a tremendous amount of energy that carries onto our shorelines that makes life a little bit more difficult in terms of shoreline erosion and shoreline restoration and things like that. So our coastline, again, I keep hearing this, it's just a lake. It's just the lakes. It's not the ocean. Well, when we look at the miles of shoreline, we actually have, now these aren't calculated the exact same way, but they're pretty darn close. The Great Lakes in the United States, we have about 4,500 miles of shoreline. And on the East Coast, you know, we've got about 2,000, a little over 2,000 miles. We have about double the Great Lakes shoreline in the US than we have on the East Coast of the United States. Gulf Coast has even less, the Pacific Coast has less. Now this is excluding Alaska and Hawaii. But in terms of lower 48 ocean coastline, we've got about 4,800 miles of coastline. The Great Lakes coastline, we've got about 4,500. We don't have more than the rest of the US, but we're pretty darn close to it. Ohio has about 210 miles of shoreline, of coastline on Lake Erie. If you look, South Carolina only has 187 miles. Now this is excluding a lot of our little estuaries and bays and stuff like that. Same with South Carolina, but in terms of actual lake facing shoreline, high energy systems, we have more coastline than South Carolina does. So we have a tremendous natural resource out there that's pretty surprising to most people. So obviously our coastline is impacted by the water levels, and this is a timely subject and topic for this year and last year, right? So Lake Erie's water levels have changed an awful lot in the past, right? And that continues today. So this image, let me move my little screen around so I can see all of this. This is essentially a chart of Lake Erie water levels going back to when we started collecting data, which was around 1860. Cleveland they began collecting water level on Lake Erie, surveying water level back in 1860, and that's continued today. So that's what this graph shows. But what it shows is year on the x-axis on the bottom, and each of these tick marks or lines is decades, and then this is water elevation in feet. And so the bottom is 568 feet. You know, average Lake Erie water level is 571.2 feet right here. And today we're at 574.4 feet or so. And there's a couple of things you see in this graph that I wanted to point out. One is you see this up and down, this regular fluctuation. Every year we have that. And what that is our highest water level occurs usually in like late June or so, about this time of year. And then when we get into wintertime, we're at a low. Why is that? Well, during the summertime, we have a lot of evaporation when the lakes are hot, right? On a hot day, the Lake Erie could lose an inch of water on a hot, dry day with a good amount of wind. We could lose an inch of water, maybe even a couple inches of water in a day. So we get more evaporation during, midsummer and fall when the water's warmer and the air's warmer and it's drier. And during the winter time, when the water's cold and it doesn't evaporate as much. And when do we get most of our precipitation? We get most of that in like the springtime. And same thing with the rest of the Great Lakes. Our water level in Lake Erie is dictated by water level of what's coming into the lake. 90% of the water coming into Lake Erie comes from the Detroit River. And what feeds the Detroit River? Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior. So all of that snowpack up in the upper Great Lakes that they get in the wintertime, all of that water flows through Lake Erie. So by the time we hit summer here, that's when all of that water has been flowing from up there. Water levels of flow rates are at their highest. And that's why we see this high in the summertime and why we see this low in this annual variation in the wintertime. So that's one of the dynamics you see. The other thing you see is that we go through these, that's that short-term variation. We also see this kind of longer-term fluctuation. People talk about it and saying, oh, it's a 15-year time period of fluctuation. It's not necessarily the case. It varies a lot more than that. There is no real periodicity, if that's a word, to this, but it does vary an awful lot. And it's become, you know, certainly in the past 50 years, there's 60 years, it seems like that variation has been increasing. The low we ever had was back in the 1930s in the Dust Bowl era, when lake water hit about 568 feet. So 568 feet, that's about around 6 foot lower than we have today. So Lake Erie during the Dust Bowl era is was about 6 foot lower than it is today. Right now, we have never seen water levels. So this chart ended, I need to update my, this chart. It ended, I want to say in like October or September of last year. This year, it basically came up to essentially the exact same high. And today we're right about here. So water level has changed an awful lot, and that has a lot of impacts on our coastal zone. During those low water periods, we would have, this is a picture of East Harbor State Park. And I believe this was from the mid 60s during this kind of low water period. If you notice, these are cottonwood trees along the shoreline. These are cottonwood trees along the shoreline. This is a modern day photo. This is an older photo taken when we have lower water levels. And there's a lot more impacts to, this is one of those things we'll talk about tomorrow is shoreline erosion and how do we restore places like that. But, when water is much lower, the shoreline's much farther out. The wave energies hitting the shoreline, like you have at Lakeside right now, would be much, much lower under these sort of time periods than it would under these higher water periods. So that has a dramatic impact on our shoreline that's out here. So in terms of some of the modern day environmental challenges that face the lake, again, this is kind of from that 1900 era, is kind of sort of to today. And then again, tomorrow we'll talk a lot more in depth about all of these things. Everyone has heard about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, right? And that happened, it happened a number of different times, but it really only got publicity one time. That is one of the watershed moments in the environmental movement in our country, in our world in general. And it's still kind of mind-blowing to see an image where the water was actually burning in the river. Around the same sort of time frame, we had a lot of algal blooms on Lake Erie. And this is a snapshot of one of those algal blooms during that time period. Now, some of these things are still occurring today, like the algal blooms, but there's a really big difference. Both of those issues that we had were essentially caused by point sources of pollution. And what I mean by point sources of pollution is, in the case of the burning river, we had a lot of factories in Cleveland that were essentially dumping untreated wastewater effluent from different factories and things like that. They were dumping it directly into the river, into the Cuyahoga River. So we had a lot of pHs and a lot of things floating, oils and stuff like that could burn. And that's how the river caught on fire. Because we didn't really have the environmental regulations that we have today that prevented it. Virtually all of the stuff coming out of here that led to the river catching on fire came out of a pipe. So we call those point source pollutions, because we can point directly to that pipe and we can measure the water quality and say, this is coming out of that pipe. And in that regard, it's really easy to then regulate it and address that specific location. Same sort of thing happened with those algal blooms that Lake Erie saw in like the 70s, is most of the nutrients, so algal blooms are essentially caused by excess nutrients. That those nutrients, when they get into the water column, cause excess plant growth, and algae are essentially a plant. So back in the 70s, most of the nutrients that were flowing into the lake, again, they were coming out of a pipe. They were coming out of a point source. And what that point source was largely wastewater treatment plants in all of the cities and communities and things that are in the Lake Erie watershed. So that's nice. It's really easy to address through something like regulation, through the Clean Water Act, because when we can pinpoint exactly where that source is coming from, we can do something at that source to address it. And that's one of the things that the Clean Water Act did, is it regulated those point sources of pollution. So that now, once we clean up those point sources, now we don't have the environmental impacts that we have. Now, and that's a very big difference from what we see today. So Lake Erie has always been at the forefront of environmental issues that revolve around water and water quality. which is a really interesting thing for Ohio and where you guys recreate up at Lakeside. We've also had in Lake Erie, there's been a number of fishery changes throughout these European times of Lake Erie and the development of Ohio. And that's essentially what this chart shows, is it's showing dominant species in Lake Erie in terms of commercial and recreational harvests of fish species. So really, when we go really, really far back into the mid 1800s, we actually had a really big, vibrant muskie and northern pike commercial fishery focused on the western basin of Lake Erie. And that fishery collapsed, before the 1890s. And one of the reasons that it collapsed was the loss of habitat, the changing of our coastal wetland areas. And again, that's something we'll talk more about tomorrow. Habitat loss led to the loss of our muskie and northern pike. So that happened a long time ago. Then we had a long time period where our fishery was really dominated by Cisco, which is a fish species that is now Lake herring or Cisco. We still have them in the other Great Lakes. We don't have them anymore in Ohio. It's basically been fished out. And habitat changes in the Central Basin dead zone, we think, are some of the reasons why we've since lost that fishery. So Cisco are gone. Most of our muskie and pike, we still have a few. They're mostly gone. Then we had this time period where we were largely dominated by blue walleye or blue pike. And that fishery collapsed too in the around the 1950s, early 1960s. And what blue walleye were is, I believe the science is currently saying that it's a subspecies of the current walleye we have today. And this is an image of kind of what they would have looked like. They were very similar to our yellow walleye or green walleye that we have today, a little bit smaller, and they had kind of a bluish coloration. And they also had some morphological differences too, in terms of like how the eyes were shaped and things like that. They were really well adapted to Central Basin of Lake Erie and those colder waters and things like that. And we had a massive fishery for them. And some of the people on here may even remember that. But by the time we hit 1960s, they were gone. This image was from a walleye that were caught up in Canada. It's not the same species as the blue pike we had here. It's just a color variation change of that we see in our walleye. But one of the reasons I leave it in here is so people can kind of see it was apparently supposed to look a little bit more like this. So those are now gone. They are extinct. They don't live here anymore, just like Cisco don't. We also had, yellow perch have always been a pretty substantial fishery here. Same thing with walleye. We've had some time periods where we had good numbers of walleye. The walleye numbers kind of come and go, and now we're kind of at a peak again for walleye. We also had smelt, which are not a native fish species. They're an invasive fish species. We had a really large smelt fishery during, from say the mid to late 1900s, and then that's kind of collapsed too. We still have them here. They're not gone. But those fish species, they come and go. And that's kind of a natural impact, but it's also an impact that humans have had on both on the water quality of the lake as well as the actual harvest of those fish. In moving to more kind of modern day timely issues, harmful algal blooms. This is kind of the elephant in the room in terms of Lake Erie environmental challenges and problems that we face now. This is an image from July 30th, 2011. This is August 19th, 2011. So you can see it's getting bigger. And then by October 2011, it's gotten even bigger. This, if you can see the satellite image, this is Cleveland. The waterfront or the city of Cleveland. Lakeside is right here. You can see the Marblehead Quarry. It shows up really starkly on here, and Toledo's way over here. This was, I believe 2011 was still the largest algal bloom that we had, that we've seen to date. And this white line, although this image is kind of cut off, that's 100 miles long for scale. This is a massive, massive, massive algal bloom. And these are some other images of what it looks like. If you guys haven't seen it, you generally don't get as big of impacts of it out by Lakeside like we do a little bit farther west of, say, Catawba Island in that western basin, the Maumee Bay kind of area. But it's pretty stark. This is a drone image of me on my boat. I actually helped film a documentary I guess it was a couple years ago, for some folks out on the boat. We put a drone up in the air, and it's big enough that you can see it on satellite. It's pretty stark if you see it up close too. And it's got a lot of issues. Those harmful algal blooms, this type, it can generate a toxin called microcystin. And microcystin toxin is one of the most toxic substances known to man. And there's a lot of dynamics at play with that algal bloom, and the bloom versus that bloom, the algal cells that are basically making up the bloom, they're microscopic unicellular organisms. Sometimes they produce the toxin, sometimes they don't. Forecasting the bloom is something we care about, but also a lot of scientists and researchers are trying to learn how to forecast the toxicity. Just because you have a bloom doesn't mean it's generating high levels of the toxins to make it unsafe for people. But there are times when the toxin levels get so high that high enough that we've had to shut down water. So we've had Toledo has basically had to turn off their water because of it. Other coastal communities have had the same thing. Over by in Western Ottawa County, Oak Harbor, their water supply is the lake too. And they've also had to shut their water supply down because of this. And they've had to do it much more times than Toledo has. This toxin can cause neurological issues. It can cause liver failure. There have been pets that have died from this. We haven't had any humans that have died from it yet. There's a lot of research going on. And again, we'll talk more about this tomorrow. A lot of research going on nowadays at Ohio State University in particular, looking at looking at human health impacts from this. And one of the things they're starting to see is in areas that have algal blooms like this, they're starting to see clusters of neurological disorders like ALS and those sorts of things because of people, whether it's drinking it, whether it's volatilizing, and basically they're breathing in small concentrations of this stuff over time. But that is something that we're seeing with our harmful algal blooms, is we are seeing human health impacts from this. And obviously, this is a picture of my son and my wife over at Kelly's Island, Kelly's Island State Park. And, that gives me pause. I grew up swimming in this water. We didn't have our algal blooms. They didn't really start up until about the year 2000, 2002 or so. How safe is this to happen? In the future, to be recreated. And again, that's something we'll talk a lot more about tomorrow. You guys have probably all seen this sign before. Said, don't swim in it. Why do we have that? Well, there are 3 locations throughout the Great Lakes that experience big algal blooms. One of those is Green Bay in Wisconsin, right here. If you look at Green Bay, what's the watershed in Green Bay? Highly agriculturally dominated. Another area, Saginaw Bay, right here. What's the watershed look like? It's primarily agriculture. And then the big one of them all, the biggest one, is by far the Lake Erie watershed and the Lake Erie algal bloom. And again, it's largely driven by watershed dynamics that we face. Why excess nutrients? That's really the primary factor. That's really a topic of conversation in and of itself. If other people have questions about it, we can talk a little more about it now, but I'm not going to jump too far into that today. That's really for better left for tomorrow. There's also one other big factor that's changing, and that's climate change. We are seeing climate change impacts here in a big way. And there's kind of 3 different factors that we look at that we're seeing in our local weather patterns, in our local climate patterns. One of which is increasing temperatures. If you've been here in the wintertime for a substantial period of time, ice cover is dramatically different than it used to be. I mean, our weather patterns have always been very, very high levels of variation in our weather patterns, right? The Great Lakes, they form their own weather. It's some of the hardest places in the world to forecast weather because the Great Lakes generate their own weather. But we are seeing increasing temperatures. When my dad was a kid, he grew up in Marblehead. My grandmother is from Marblehead. My grandma used to have an ice box here, and it was always filled with ice from Lake Erie. Every year, a lot of the commercial fishermen, they would harvest ice out of the Great Lakes, out of Lake Erie in particular. That was an actual job of people harvesting ice. That doesn't happen anymore. Obviously, we have modern day refrigeration, but we don't have the ice like that to support something like that. Back when my dad was a kid, and certainly when my grandparents were kids, you know, it was nothing to drive across to the islands, over to Kelly's Island and Put in Bay, in cars and vehicles and things like that. And now to be able to even to take a four-wheeler or a snowmobile out on the ice, that's a cold winter, you know. Back then, back in the 60s, 70s and before, you know, it was a really, really warm winter, an oddly warm winter when you couldn't do something like that. So I don't know if my son he's never been able to ice fish on Lake Erie. I've never felt comfortable enough taking him out there. And I don't know that my son will ever grow up ice fishing on Lake Erie, because we're seeing that change. So that's one of the things that we're seeing. We're also seeing dramatically different precipitation trends and patterns. And the last 2 years have really been very indicative of that. Last year, it was such a wet spring that a lot of our crops in this region of Ohio, northern Ohio, simply couldn't even get planted. The farmers couldn't get out into their fields because it was too muddy. This year, on the flip side, well, at least up until maybe a few days ago, it was so dry we were approaching drought conditions out here. We have in Lake Erie, 90% of our water in Lake Erie comes from the upper Great Lakes. 10% of our water comes from the Lake Erie watershed itself. Increasing precipitation, we are seeing about 10% more precipitation on an annual basis than historical. So we are seeing more of that. That's really the primary reason why we're seeing higher water levels today, because we're having more rain than we used to have. Now we're also having the impact of the way that our rain is falling has changed dramatically. You know, when I was a kid, and I'm only 35 years old, you know, it was pretty common in the springtime where we would get an inch of rain or 2 inches of rain in a day or 2 days. You know, you would have a rainy day where it would just kind of drizzle or rain all day long, but it wasn't downpouring. Today, that's pretty uncommon. Now, most of our rain, even in the middle of springtime when we're getting most of our rain, now the majority of our rain comes in these big episodic events, these big storms where we get an inch of rain in an hour, 2 hours, instead of an inch of rain in a day. And when that happens, it dramatically changes how that water moves through the watershed and ends up into the lake. More of that water that falls in the watershed is ending up in the lake, because when you get 3 inches of rain in a day, it can't soak into the ground. It's flowing over the land, out into the rivers, and dumping out into the lake really, really rapidly, carrying a lot more nutrients, carrying a lot more sediment, impacting the water quality issues that we have. And that's one of the things we're seeing in terms of water level fluctuations and water quality impacts. Our spoiler alert for tomorrow, a lot of our algal bloom issues have a really, really big climate change component to it. A lot of our water quality algal issues are not necessarily, yes, it's driven by largely by agricultural impacts, but a lot of those farmers, they're not doing worse than they ever did before. They're actually employing better practices than they have before. But the reason it's not having the same beneficial impacts they had before is because of our increasing precipitation, or our changes to our precipitation patterns that we really never had before. And there's some other weather impacts, storm impacts that drive erosion and stuff like that we're seeing too. But those are really more things for tomorrow. With that, I guess that was just over an hour or so. I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys have, and also want to give a plug for tomorrow. Please feel free to join in, and we'll dive in much more on those impacts. You don't have to have listened to this one to watch the one tomorrow. You don't necessarily need to join in tomorrow, but having the two together will give you a kind of a background and frame of reference for discussing these things tomorrow. So with that, that's my email address. Please feel free to reach out, and I hope you guys can join us tomorrow. And I'm happy to stick around as long as you guys have questions.
We do have a couple questions that came in. So I'd like to, I know you've seen the ones that have come up on the Q&A, but the last one that came in the last couple minutes is, are there any ways we can make lemonade from lemons? So when it comes to algae, can we harvest it for energy or something like that?
Yeah, that's That's an interesting question, and stuff we've talked about, people have talked about here. And with that, trying to harvest, so one of the challenges with trying to harvest the algae that's out there is the scale. When we're talking those algal blooms, relatively short-lived, we're talking weeks, and they're frequently occupying areas that are hundreds and hundreds of square miles in size. To be able to filter all of that out, I mean, if we had a way that we could pluck each of those harmful algal bloom cells out, sure. But the idea of going out into the lake and trying to filter hundreds of square miles rapidly without, and only filtering out the algae cells and not filtering out the juvenile fish, the beneficial algal cells, because there is a lot of beneficial algae out there, the zooplankton, the fish, and all of that stuff. It's the same kind of challenge that faces people when they in dealing with that big North Pacific gyre trash or plastic issue, right? We can filter the plastic out, but how do we filter the plastic or the algae out without having the negative impacts of pulling out all of the other good stuff that's mixed in with it? So I don't think that's, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be a good solution for that.
Too much else besides just lemons.
Yeah, it's kind of lemons, unfortunately.
So we do have a couple people saying they're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Okay.
But some questions that came in here on Facebook. I just lost them. The latest one, the west end of Lakeside is experiencing increased erosion in the last few years.
Yeah.
It's been described as a complex fix due to the existing breakwater and flow of water. Can you share insights on what could help slow or prevent more erosion?
Oh, yeah. Water level going down would help a lot. When we get to high water levels that we have today, the armor stone, the rocks that were placed there on the west side of Lakeside and everywhere around our shoreline, this is not just solely a Lakeside issue, that was placed there to deal with water levels that were never as high as they are today. And to address that, there's a lot of different ways you could deal with it. One of the challenges we face is when, this happened, it's episodic, right? We're not losing an inch a day so that like over the course of a month, we're seeing a little bit erode a little bit at a time. What's happening is one storm event is dramatically changing that. And that's the same sort of impact we had with Lake Erie or East Harbor State Park's beach. These coastal dynamics are really driven, they're episodic events. So that's much harder to plan for. If we could reduce wave energy on the shoreline, we could help stabilize and prevent that erosion. The downside to that, and again, this is more stuff we'll talk about tomorrow. This is one of the exact topics we're going to discuss tomorrow is coastal erosion, both on our beaches, like at East Harbor and Lakeside. One of the ways you deal with that, knocking wave energy down would be one impact. More rock could help reduce that. Could we restore a beach? Could you do something like that so that those waves are breaking not on the shoreline and on that soft substrate, like on that soil and grass, but if you could cause them to break a little bit farther offshore so they're not washing up on the beach, that would help. How you do that, there's a million different ideas for how to do that. None of them are cheap. They're all very complicated. They're all very they're I don't know if I want to steal my thunder for tomorrow. It is stuff that could happen, but it's not real cheap to do. There is also kind of one of the elephants in the room in that regard is shoreline erosion is a natural process. Shoreline migration is a natural process. And over time, we've seen Lake Erie shoreline eroding, especially those bluffs in northeastern Ohio, which is kind of a different shoreline than we have here. Over in history, on average, we've seen a few foot per year of that shoreline eroding and migrating. Now, when Europeans moved here, we have a different cultural perspective on land ownership today than say other people did. So when you buy your postage stamp of land on the shoreline, and you pay a pretty penny for it, you don't want your postage stamp of land to get smaller and smaller and smaller each year, right? So then you get into the impact of, well, I need to stabilize what is an inherently unstable process. So then one person puts rock up or a revetment or something to stabilize that erosion. Now, when you do that, you increase erosion on the other side, or you trap sediment, or you alter how sand and sediment moves along our shorelines, which is, again, a natural process. So then what happens is you may trap sand on your land, but then your neighbor, you're starving it from your neighbor. So next thing you know, your neighbor's putting in rock, and then everyone's putting in rock. And next thing you know, the entire shoreline is altered, and how those, and not necessarily in a good way from an erosional standpoint. So it's complicated. If someone told you it's complex, they are correct. It is. So hopefully that answered a little bit of the question.
I think so. And looking at the questions on Facebook, so we did have a few questions that I feel pretty comfortable saying, if you are able to tune in tomorrow, we'll maybe do that, because I don't want to take all of his presentation from tomorrow in this Q&A. A few of those included what impact is building on the estuary, swampy lands, and shorelines have on the lake. And then what is the cost, not financial, of repairing our shoreline wetlands that have been lost? So I think those are probably ones that you'll tap into tomorrow.
Yes.
One question I did want to get to that you could probably cover today, since it's talking about over time, but we had one come in about, are the lakes geologically moving or growing or shrinking over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're changing. I don't know that, at least I haven't studied this. I'm not a geologist. I'm an aquatic ecologist. I'm not a climatologist. I really rely on those people to do the sort of work that I'm doing. Generally, with more precipitation, we are seeing, in terms of growing, we are seeing the lake increase with more precipitation. So there, over the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years or so, there's been a lot of questions about, what the future of the Great Lakes looks like. Are we going to have more water? Are water levels going to go up, or water levels going to go down? Which, again, is a natural process. We used to think that, and there's this trade-off, right, between higher water temperatures in warmer climates leads to more evaporation. So that would lead to lower water levels. But then that's also competing with and fighting with increased precipitation, which is raising water levels. So it's this constant back and forth tugging of which of those is going to win out in terms of water levels. We used to think that the increased precipitation was not going to be enough extra water to offset the amount of evaporation, especially with decreased ice. And one of the things we're seeing is, we think the climatologists are starting to think, well, maybe in the future, instead of lower water levels being more of the norm, maybe higher water levels are going to be more of the norm. But I'll be honest, it's so hard to predict those things. The only thing we know is the variation is likely to continue. It's entirely possible that the water levels are going to stay this way, that today, what we see today may very well be the average for the next 100 years. We really don't know. So in terms of, are the Great Lakes growing or shrinking over time from a water volume perspective? I don't know. They're probably not going to be changing that much over time. Isostatic rebound from the past glaciation period is, generally speaking, kind of come to an equilibrium. We're kind of stagnant. Where we are today is probably where it's going to be for the next few thousand years, at least until Niagara Falls again erodes into Lake Erie. And then the Niagara River, the Niagara River is essentially a really small filter, a really small pipe at the end of Lake Erie. When Niagara Falls eventually erodes into Lake Erie, so that now Lake Erie is going to drain straight through, there won't be Niagara Falls anymore. Now out in front of Lakeside will no longer be a lake. But again, we're talking thousands or tens of thousands of years into the future, to the point of almost irrelevance. So the Great Lakes are kind of saying the same. They are growing in terms of footprint from the perspective of shoreline erosion. Shoreline erosion is a natural process. Generally speaking, when water and land is, that land-water interface is generally, water wins. And the shoreline generally erodes. There are places where shorelines do build up, where sand accumulates and things. But those are usually, that's pretty rare. It's not usually offset by the erosion. I will say though, that because we've hardened our shoreline so much, like we have at Lakeside with all the big armor stone, generally speaking, we've kind of stabilized that. We do see erosion, but not, the erosion we're seeing now is more like you're seeing on the western side of Lakeside and not like the shoreline moving 100 foot inland. So that was probably way more info than you needed to answer that one question.
That was good. So we had two more questions. I think we have time for two more. And the one I'll get to first is, from time to time, some Southwest United States oriented folks begin to talk about exporting Great Lakes water to those much drier states. Is anything going on regarding this idea?
No. During, I'm going to go way back in my presentation, a bunch of slides where I showed you the water level variation. So right here. Now this is only showing Lake Erie's water level. But during this time period from 2000 to 2014 or so, Lake Erie was kind of hovering around its long-term average, which was 571.2 feet. Lake Erie was at average, long-term average. The upper Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Huron, Superior, they were at record low water levels during this time period. And all of the Great Lakes states and the Canadian provinces that border the Great Lakes, they signed the Great Lakes Compact, which essentially said it is illegal to export water from the Great Lakes to areas like the arid Southwest. Because at the time, we were seeing record low water levels. Now we're seeing record high water levels in such a short time span. So when they signed those laws into effect, we never envisioned this happening so quickly. So as of right now, the law of the land states that Great Lakes water cannot leave the basin. And there have been court cases up in Wisconsin where, what's the name of the city up there? I can't remember. One of the suburbs of Milwaukee or Chicago, I believe, I can't remember, where they wanted to basically take in Great Lakes water into their, they were just beyond the watershed, right? And the watershed, if we go back to the map. Okay, so right here. So over here, there is a community just beyond this watershed boundary that wanted to harvest Lake Erie. They wanted to use Lake Michigan water for their municipal water, for a city, a community that was growing. And that was kind of the first challenge to that Great Lakes Compact. And I can't remember, honestly, I can't remember what the end result was, but for a long time they were saying, no, you cannot do that. Not even for a community, you cannot export this water even barely beyond the watershed, because just on the other side of this watershed boundary, water flows into the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. So as of right now, I know there's a lot of people that would love to not have as much water, but there are also some trade-offs. The Great Lakes shipping industry, I can't remember how much it is for every foot of water that there is in the Great Lakes, additional foot of water, they can carry a lot more cargo. So there's a lot of, it's complicated, but no, I am not aware of any challenges or changes, potential changes to that in terms of exporting water to other regions.
Wow. Okay. I've been curious about that one too. I'd heard
Yeah.
that.
I'll add that to tomorrow's too.
Tomorrow's.
That's a good one, because if this is, nothing says Lake Erie couldn't rise another 2 foot. If that happens, is that going to change? I don't know. It's a good question.
Yes, great questions coming in. So this will be the last question, and I'm going to ask a combination of the two since it came up a couple times. But what can people do individually? What can citizens do to make a difference in terms of topics that were covered in today's talk to keep Lake Erie safe?
That's a good question. Supporting people that do this work, supporting the organizations that do this work, whether through, financial contributions certainly help and they're good, but also just being an advocate for this stuff, whether it's, working with your local representatives, local or regional representatives, getting those people to understand that these things are important. And it's not that it goes beyond just the money, right? Certainly, we didn't even get into how big of an impact Lake Erie fisheries are, how important that is to the communities and the recreation is. But, you know, there's a lot that can't be put into dollar figures for this. Like I showed at the beginning of what does it mean for most people growing up here, like me. When I grew up here, I said, man, if I ever want to do this kind of work, I got to go to the ocean. Great Lakes, no one cares about those. Ohio doesn't have the sense of appreciation of its coastal resources that, say, Michigan does. You know, we don't associate ourselves with that. We've lost a lot of our access points for that. You know, people here just don't appreciate it like they used to. And changing that is something that could go a long way, in addition to supporting, voting for these sorts of things, encouraging those people, you know, the governmental officials to support these kind of restoration efforts and impacts on the Great Lakes. That, you know, that makes a really, really big difference. So being engaged, being an advocate for this stuff, and bringing people up here that wouldn't otherwise be exposed to this, you know, changing that sentiment from people that, and I know we're talking to people from Lakeside, right? You guys are up here because you care about this resource, but you'd be surprised at the number of local people here that don't have that appreciation for this natural resource and that grew up here and still are being raised here. So all of those things would be really, really important to have an impact. And those would probably be the biggest ones for how you could help.
So I think probably just tuning in today was a good start to that, and then filling people in on what you've learned, and then everyone who's joined us today, make sure you tune in tomorrow. We did have a lot of questions that came in we weren't able to answer, but like I said, some of those are going to be part of his discussion, part of Matt's discussion tomorrow. So I hope that everyone can join us again. We'll be at 10:30. Again, we'll be on Zoom webinar and also being streamed live on Facebook. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Matt. That was fascinating. I learned so much. So I can't wait to see what more you bring tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I'm some of these things I wasn't planning to include, like plastic. I'm going to include those things in tomorrow's talk too. So thanks for the feedback. And thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, we're sending everyone our love from Lakeside. Stay safe and healthy, and we will see you all again tomorrow. Bye-bye.